Hey everyone, my name is Vivek Saraswat, and I'm a venture partner at Mayfield, an early stage venture capital firm. And I'm here today for the Open Core Summit to talk to you about hooks and upsell, bottoms up product and go-to-market strategy. So let's get started. So who am I and why should you care what I have to say on this topic? Well, I've over my career had the privilege and fortune of working at a number of companies that have had experience or assisted with bottoms up and enterprise product strategy and go-to-market. I started my career in engineering, working at both big companies and startups before moving to the wonderful world of product. First at AWS, where I worked on Elastic Block Store, and then at VMware, where I launched and ran the Cloud Native Storage Applications Initiative, focused on open source integrations for things like containers. That led me to Docker, where I launched and ran Docker's primary enterprise product, really taking that groundswell of developer usage and building enterprise IT customers. I'm now at Mayfield, early stage VC firm, where I've invested in a number of companies that are in the open source or developer tooling world, like dev.to or Zettabytes. And I've also assisted and worked with a number of our portfolio companies in open source, like Rancher and HashiCorp. In particular, I help our companies around enterprise and bottoms-up product strategy and go-to-market. So I wanted to give a little overview into go-to-market and talk about why it's important in the first place. I think when it comes to a lot of technical companies, in particular in the open source world, people know about building good product. They know about selling that product, but there's actually a lot more sophistication that goes into go-to-market, and that's really important to think about. So what is go-to-market or GTM exactly? If you go to Wikipedia, you get a relatively complicated definition that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. So my TLDR on GTM is this. It's really three things. It's getting customers to understand the product, what the value proposition is for them, and that's really about marketing. It's getting customers to use the product or how you get the product to the customers, and that's really about distribution. And it's getting customers to actually pay for the product, which is typically sales, but in a bottoms-up or product-led go-to-market motion, it's also about what you do in the product itself. So why does all of this matter in the first place? Well, if you look at most B2B startups, they kind of function like this. They build a product that's really cool, that fits a need they understand. They then figure out how to sell the product based on what they've built. But then it might turn out that for the target market that they're approaching, the way in that the product was built doesn't really fit what's necessary for the customer, or doesn't fit the sales motion. And so they have to iterate, pivot, and start over if things don't work. Smart B2B startups work like this. They understand their target market first, spending a lot of time understanding the users and buyers, choose the best fit go-to-market strategy for that target market and those target users and buyers. They then build the product to match that go-to-market strategy. And I'm a firm believer that product and go-to-market are tied to the hip, and that you build a product to match bottoms up or to match top down, for example. They then go and market and sell that product using the chosen go-to-market strategy. And this is something that some of the top commercial open source companies have used as a strategy. As an example, the CEO of HashiCorp, Dave McJannet, in a talk recently mentioned that the number one things he thinks a startup entrepreneur should focus on is deeply understanding go-to-market as a part of the product building process. So that's why I think of these two tied at the hip. So what are the most known GTM strategies? There's three that are typically discussed. The traditional one for enterprise is known as top-down. This is where you insert and communicate to executives, so C-level or VP level folks, and that's how you insert the product and bring it in the first place. Once it's paid for, usage is typically pushed down to managers and doers or individual contributors within the organization. And critically, the upsell is typically still done at the executive level. So it's really about that vision sale and building that high-level platform. The next most common known methodology is bottoms up, which we're talking the most about today. This is where the insertion for the product is really done at doers, at individual contributors in the organization who are looking to solve a problem, and they're the ones who are going to use the solution. Typically, this is done in a free or a trial manner. Then the upsell, it can be done at the individual contributor level, but more often it's done at middle management, managers and directors, and then up the scale to executives. This is also often considered as product-led growth, and open source is really commonly used for this. The third most commonly known strategy is called middle out, and this is where the insertion is done at the managerial level. And typically they're ones who are looking for a specific solution and have some amount of budget to pay for it. And then usage is done by those managers or is pushed down to individual contributors in the organization. And the upsell is done at the managerial level up to the executives as necessary. So again, these are the most common strategies. We're going to be talking primarily about bottoms up today. I think it's also important to talk through the various sales models that are used. And importantly, with these three sales models, they can be attached to different forms of go-to-market strategies. So we'll start first with self-serve. This is pretty straightforward. The customer adopts and buys the product with no sales team required. This is really what's most commonly used at the beginning of a bottoms-up business. Lead gen is typically done inbound via community or advertising. The sales cycle has to be no touch, as in there's no sales team involved talking with your customer. And the process can take days or weeks or even hours, depending on your product. The average deal sizes for these are smaller. They're typically less than $10,000 on an annual basis. And that means you really need a massive customer base in order to get this to work. And you need to ensure that your product has really quick time to value. People really get the value of your product without you having to think about it, without you having to do anything about it. And some kind of organic virality, how customers and buyers and users refer each other to the product. The next commonly known sales type is inside sales, and this is often layered on top of a self-serve model. This is where you have a sales team that doesn't travel. They take video and phone meetings, not in person typically, and that's how they start and close the sale. This can be inbound for lead gen with community and advertising, as with self-serve, but also there's often some outbound with prospecting to customers, finding them over LinkedIn, for example. This is, in comparison, a low-touch sales process, more than no touch from self-serve. It can take weeks or months. The average deal sizes can go up, so 5 figures on average, but you might be able to get into the 6-figure range. And again, this is best for maybe a customer base that isn't quite as large, or that's layered on top as a community upsell path from self-serve. And there's some product friction involved, or because of the explaining the value proposition, or it's just a higher revenue sale. This can be done for bottoms up, and it can also be done most typically for middle out type GTM strategies. And the third most commonly known sales type is field sales. This is your typical enterprise sales team that travels, that meets folks in person. This is often done through not only prospecting and hunting for customers, but also through relationships and high-level referrals, particularly at the C-suite and VP level. This can be a high-touch process, lots of meetings, maybe months or even years, depending on the enterprise sale that you're dealing with. And this is really best for 6-figure or 7-figure deal sizes. This can work when you're targeting a small customer base like the Global 2000 or Fortune 100 with very large budgets and high product friction and complexity. And again, this is what you're going to most commonly see top down, though, as we'll see, even a bottoms up model could eventually evolve to have a field sales type. Okay. Well, we've talked about the various go-to-market strategies, but this is the Open Core Summit, so we're going to be really focusing on bottoms up. And I think bottoms up really is the best strategy for open source, and it's not just me. A lot of businesses say the same. This is because you can start by focusing on a large community base of users, for example, developers, who are typically looking to solve a problem and want a really great experience in solving that problem. So they're going to take a self-serve version of your product in open source. It's an open source download or maybe a desktop tool. And usually that usage is free. You may be able to layer a self-serve model on top of this that gives you some amount of ARR, but typically it's free in open source. As you start to consider monetization, you're really going up the chain to the managerial level. And sometimes this is in the same group like engineering or developers. Sometimes this moves over to another group like IT. And these folks have different concerns from your developer. They're typically looking for supported software and peace of mind in that support. And they're looking for team efficiency, how to make the overall team or organization more effective. This is often done through an inside sales mechanism, maybe on a SaaS platform. And it can be 10K plus ARR, as we talked about last time. Once you've sort of built up enough groundswell adoption and buyer adoption, you might be able to move to looking at the C-suite or VP level, for example, VP of Infra or Engineering. These folks' concerns are a little bit different. Now they're looking for a centralized service to really centralize usage of the product and the platform. And they're thinking of higher level concerns like CapEx and OpEx reduction. This can often still be done with an inside sales, but sometimes this is the point where you layer on a field sales model. Many companies go through this transition, starting with free and self-serve, layering on an inside sales model, and then eventually getting to enterprise field sales. Sometimes they don't even make it to field sales before the IPO. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about why bottoms-up go-to-market matters for open source, how do you actually start thinking about product and go-to-market strategy within bottoms-up? With the various companies that I've worked with or been a part of, I've come to consider a framework that I call hooks and upsell for bottoms-up adoption. It goes something like this. The first thing that you focus on is creating hooks. This is about growing user adoption. And these hooks are typically something that solve a clear burning pain point, that target a massive user base, and that use a lightweight viral insertion. And we'll go through each of these in depth. Once you really focus on growing that user adoption, doesn't mean that you can completely avoid monetizing. You might have a little bit of revenue in there, for example, from self-serve, but you're really, really trying to build a strong community base. Once you've done that, then you start thinking about upselling, particularly to higher level buyers. This is where you monetize via the buyer. And this involves three main things. It involves understanding what buyers really want. It involves influencing the buyer to come to you in an inbound process. And it's about making the product as easy to buy as humanly possible. So let's go through each of these in depth. We'll start with a hook. A hook is about solving a clear, burning pain point. If you look at a typical user, for example, a developer, they might be building an application and they have a gap or a problem with that application that they need to solve, and they need to solve now in the easiest way possible. So this is about what I call making your product critical path. It's about making your products embedded so deeply and so importantly in the user workflow architecture that eventually the buyer can't afford not to pay for it. I typically consider critical path as two possible different options. One is that you're automating a key, frequent, painful workflow for the user. One example of this in the open source world is what happened with Docker and containers in the early days. Most people think of Docker, they start thinking of microservices and 12-factor apps. But really in the early days, Docker helped people solve application dependency and versioning management. I have Python 2.0.0 and I want to upgrade it 2.0.1 for my application without breaking other dependencies. This is a problem for developers, and it's a problem that Docker solved very effectively. Outside of the open source world, but still in DevTools, PagerDuty solved incident response as a workflow. So this is my application or my customer is on fire, and I really need to quickly page the right person to solve the problem. That's a unfortunately key, frequent, and painful workflow for a lot of companies. PagerDuty solved that problem. The second piece outside of workflow is about what I call creating a utility. This is a fundamental architecture piece that sits quietly in the background and does something important for the developer to solve. A good example of this is Kafka, which Confluent folks are backing, which really was an event streaming platform. So something that the most data-intensive companies use today and depend on. Outside of the open source world, Stripe is a great example. It's an API that developers use to quickly and efficiently solve payments problems. So these are critical path solutions. One important distinction I want to make is that technical complexity does not necessarily equal user value. So there's a lot of folks who want to build something technically cool, and they assume that because it's technically wonderful, that's why people will use it. But ultimately, when you're doing bottoms up, people are trying to solve a specific problem, and they're going to pick the best and easiest problem, the best and easiest solution for that problem. Technical complexity might help you build a moat in the long term, but you should be focusing more on solving what that user pain point is. So now that you've thought through a critical path pain point, the next most important thing to think through is how you target a massive user base. This sounds kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised how many folks don't underestimate the size of a user base that you really need to target to make bottoms up work. If you look at the most effective solutions out there, they're really targeting user bases that have hundreds of thousands or millions of users. Why is this? Well, ultimately, it's just easier to cultivate a community when you have more people as a part of that community, that could be a part of that community. And the larger your user base is, the better a chance that you'll have word of mouth referrals from one person to another, and you'll have an upsell. If you've been in the open source world long enough, you know that only a certain percentage of people are actually going to buy your solution. So you should maximize your chances by increasing the number of overall users that you eventually have for that solution. I often think Doers are better than managers when it comes to user base. It's not that managers are not effective, it's that doers are the ones who are looking to implement a solution most likely and to build that solution to what they're doing. So they're typically better targets. When I think of massive user bases, I think in the ideal sense of things like developers, DevOps or IT folks, data engineers. There's just large groups of folks and they're looking to quickly find solutions to solve their problems. Not necessarily ideal executives, there's just not enough. Security folks, again, they build solutions, but there's just not enough of them. And similar issues for product managers. Note that your buyer doesn't have to necessarily be a massive base, just your users. Consider companies like SNCC, one of the only successful bottoms-up security companies, which has a large, their primary user was actually developers. That was their insertion point. The buyer was security, not necessarily as many folks there, but with a large enough budget to then pay for that solution. A similar example, HashiCorp. For most HashiCorp solutions that are commercial like Vault or Terraform, the user are developers and the buyer is IT. Third piece within the hook is really considering a lightweight viral insertion. Now, again, this is one of those things that people think about, but often implement in the wrong ways. If your user is looking for a solution that solves their pain point, they're going to want to take the most frictionless experience possible to solving that pain point. You want to make it as easy as possible for your user to download and adopt what you're doing. That means offering a free solution, typically, and in the open source world, you're going with free at this point. It also means having something that's an out-of-box use case. There's a lot of people who want to go and build the platform. They want to go and build the thing that'll eventually solve all the problems. But again, when you're thinking about that individual user, you want them to quickly solve and adopt their use case and show time to value for your solution. So whatever you can do to make your initial use case out of box and easy to solve, whether it's through the product, whether it's through documentation or through ecosystem integrations, the better off you'll be. After this, you need to think about how you can build organic virality. If you've gotten one user to adopt, how can you get other users to start adopting the solution? So I know that I said that you want to start by solving an out-of-box use case, but there is an advantage to having a long-term sandbox. Once that user has adopted that solution and found that use case, how can they go and start experimenting with other use cases upon the solution that you built? This creates what I've called the look what I built phenomenon. It's when folks start building your solution, start sharing innovative things that they've done and bringing that into the community. This builds organic virality and buzz. The next thing to think about is how you build a collaborative experience. So you've gotten one user to adopt a platform. How you get other users to start considering and using the solution, both within the same department or within other departments. So take the example of HashiCorp Vault. It's a solution that developers use for secrets management. Ultimately, IT folks are going to start using that in a production environment, and security folks are going to start looking at that for how to secure the environment. So how you build a collaborative experience, both in the free and ultimately in the paid version, can be very effective. The third piece to consider with viral insertion is how do you really build up community champions? This is what I'd call the train the trainers model. How can you get the community to advocate on your behalf? The first step is about really targeting known influencers in the community. These are the folks who, if they really like your solution, they'll advocate and other folks will look to them to start adopting. The second piece is, how can you build that train the trainer model? So an example is what we did with Docker, with the so-called Docker captains. These were influential folks within the community and within the enterprise who really advocated our solution. And so we granted them special status. We didn't pay them or anything, but we gave them sort of special roadmap presentations, for example, and at our conferences, they were recognized. And so not only did they advocate on their behalf, they started training other folks on what was important for usage of the product. So this really talks through the various aspects of the hook, really, how you grow user adoption. Now, let's say you've built that overall community. It's time to start thinking about the upsell. How are you going to monetize on this? And typically, it's on a higher level buyer than the individual doer or user. The first step to this is thinking about understanding what buyers really want and truly care about. Putting yourself in the shoes, not just of the user, but of the buyer themselves. If you look at most enterprise 1.0 products, particularly with open source, they usually have this trifecta: support, single sign-on, and access control. and I know this was my first commercial open source product as well. Here's the thing. These features are table stakes. You need them to get over the fence in enterprise, but you won't win deals just because you have them. These are the check marks. You really need to understand what drives buyer value specifically for your product. I typically bucket this into 4 different categories. The first is peace of mind. So this is what ensures that that buyer knows the solution is not going to go down, is not going to get hacked, is not going to have any other problems. This typically fits partially support, but also security related features, also high availability related features. The next step is collaboration. So a higher level buyer, like a manager, director, or at the VP level, starts to think about how that solution is being used to make the rest of the organization more efficient. So how in the paid version you can build collaboration features that increase connectivity among users can become highly effective. For what it's worth, you can use this in the free version as well, but this really does drive buyer value. The third is performance. And I don't mean by this reducing or limiting the effectiveness of your open source solution. You should never do that for users. But how can you build performance features that are very relevant to enterprise users? An example I love to give with Vault is the multi-AZ replicas is something that enterprises care about that may not be as much cared about by open source users. The final piece is really about insights. How does that higher level executive understand the effectiveness of the solution in their organization and how it's making their organization better? This can be done through analytics, dashboards, or specific metrics that really drive the business with your product. So if you want to learn more about this, I talked about this a lot in last year's Open Core Summit. You can check out the presentation below on my blog. The second piece of the buyer, now that you understand what's valuable to those buyers, is really influencing buyers to come to you. And while outbound does work for a bottoms-up motion, it's much, much more capital efficient to get buyers to come to you. How do you do this? So there is this belief, particularly in DevTools, bottoms-up, and open source, that if you build it, they will come. If you build something amazing, people will just show up. That's really just not true. In order to make this effective, you really need to have targeted buyer marketing. So ads, information on your website, participation in events and conferences that really help that buyer understand and be aware of why this product is effective. This is part of that value prop and distribution we talked about earlier. You can also use content marketing, how you take specific use cases that matter to that buyer, put out the content that they're looking for. And for what it's worth, content marketing also works pretty well on user adoption too. That's not to say that marketing is the only way to influence buyers to come to you. In fact, product features can create really strong inbound when done effectively. One example I love to give in the non-open source world is Slack. So what's the #1 feature that people pay for in Slack? It's paid search history. I've used this product for long enough that the rest of my information disappears into the ether. And now if I want to search for that history, I have to pay for the product. And this happens to every company that reaches a certain scale, and those folks come inbound to Slack to start paying. Now, I should mention that you need to have a clear division between free versus paid. You don't want to manipulate your open source or bottoms-up adoption users into thinking that they're not getting value out of their solution. You should be very clear and transparent between what's the difference between free and paid, and not make changes with those without warning. We've talked a lot about inbound. Now, at some point, you may have to go outbound. If you do, really look at identifying potential buyers who already have significant internal usage, and thus you can drive some kind of value by providing the commercial solution on top of that. The final part about the upsell is about making the product really, really easy to buy. Again, this is one of those things that sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times people don't actually do this. You want people to buy your product, and if you're doing an inbound process and you want it low touch or no touch, you need to make that upgrade as frictionless as possible. If you're going from open source, the easiest way to do this is SaaS. Traditionally, open source has gone from free to commercial with an on-prem model, but the truth is SaaS is becoming much more popular. And you look at the big successful companies in this space, and they've seen this. Both, for example, Confluent with Kafka and HashiCorp with Terraform and Vault now have cloud and managed versions of their services. The in-between for this is a managed virtual private cloud where you run on the customer's cloud environments, but you're the one who manages upgrades and versioning. If you do have to go on-prem, then figure out how you can make the swap to the commercial version as easy as possible. In previous days, some open source products required you to actually swap out binaries when you're doing an upgrade. This is a very friction-intensive process for customers. You're much better off if you have a drop-in license key that upgrades you from free to paid. The next step in making easy to buy is about selling a paid version of your free product. What I mean by that is the paid version of your product should not be substantially different in the way that it works compared to your free version. It should effectively be similar to your free version, but with added features that the buyers care about. Why is this important? Because it's about minimizing buyer re-education. You don't want to have to explain to the buyer why their product is why the paid product is different, because that just increases the friction in the sale, which reduces your capital efficiency. It also facilitates both self-serve and inside sales models. I'll give an example from my personal history. I worked on Docker's enterprise product, and the open source product was a daemon that ran on a developer's desktop, and the enterprise product was a server-grade orchestration product. So these were two very different products, and thus that did require some buyer re-education and some more capital efficiency, more capital friction in the sale. So again, the more you can do to sell a paid version of your free product, the better off you'll be. The third piece is, how do you price to grow with the value of your customer? It's tempting in the early days to have a static pricing model to get sales over the fence, and that's okay. It's also tempting to try to price highly to capitalize on the value of your product. But if you can price in, for example, a per usage or number of users model that allows you to start small with the customer, and then as they see value, they can grow the pricing of that, and your pricing is a percentage of the value to the customer, the better off you will be. It allows you to open up a wider range of ACV or annual contract values. It also allows you to start small and grow. So we've talked about a lot today. We've talked about various go-to-market strategies, bottoms up, top down, middle out, and sales options, self-serve, inside sales, and field sales. And then looking at bottoms up in particular, we talked about the hooks, which is about focusing on growing user adoption and building that community. And within that, solving a burning pain point, targeting a massive user base, and using a lightweight viral insertion. We've also talked about the upsell, then monetizing via the buyer, which means understanding what buyers really want and care about, influencing those buyers to come to you, and making the product as easy to buy as humanly possible. The last piece I'll leave you with is some key early hires I've seen that are very effective in commercial open source and bottoms-up product-led growth companies. Most people have engineers that are initially building the product. What you don't often see is an early product strategy hire. This is somebody who can help bottoms up with the product experience end to end, the difference between what's in the free versus paid features, and then how to build virality into the product. The next is product marketing. And this is user buyer personas, understanding the value prop for the customer, and then how you build the right content to create inbound. The third hire is community relations, or DevRel. And this is about outreach to the community, engaging with the community, and really building community growth. And sometimes you can get this in one person. That's a unicorn of a person. Most often it'll take 2 or maybe 3 hires to really get these key roles. So that's what I'm here to talk about on bottoms-up strategy and go-to-market. If you'd like to learn more, you can feel free to follow me on Twitter at @Saraswat, or you can check out my blog where I write about topics like this at viveksaraswat.com. So thank you very much.